Right, well, thank you for the three papers. I've enjoyed them all. And I'm not going to contradict any of them. I want to try to add to them rather than detract from them, because I largely agree with everything that's been said so far. Elaine gave a very careful analysis of the Scylla and Charybdis of practical theology. And I think she's right, this tension between what she calls internal discourse of the institutional church and a more authentic version, which was one that was prepared to engage in dialogue with non-theological disciplines and contribute actively to the shaping of public policy. I think she was right to add the words more authentic, at least in the context of Duncan Forrester. I don't think he was actually much interested in the first, the Scylla, or whatever it is. He very seldom took part in making statements on behalf of the Church of Scotland, as far as I know. And in certain areas, I think he rather radically disagreed with his colleagues in the Church of Scotland, particularly when it came to sexuality, probably Margaret Thatcher, and we could go and name a few others as well. He was a man of strong opinions, which made him, for me, deeply attractive. So I don't think he was particularly interested in that, or particularly good at it. I don't think I am either, to be honest. I think I'd cause more chaos in my own church if I started trying to shape public pronouncements. And I think your tension's right there in that characterization of him, but of the continuing tension between those two features of public theology. On the other two papers, I think Doug was exactly right. I think the prophetic challenge that really bugged Duncan was the welfare state, equality and deprivation. These really ruled his life. He hated Thatcherism, hated monetarism. He once told me, I teased him about his political position and being on the left of the Labour Party, and who's his great hero? And of course it was Tony Benn. And if he was around today, he'd be praising Corbyn, I'm sure, no question of it. And I think Corbyn and Tony Benn would be better as theologians, really, than politicians. I think that's what we need from a public theologian, somebody with passionate views, probably polarizing views, but views which defend people who are not being defended. And I think that's what outraged Duncan, whether it was the poor in Edinburgh or whether it was the poor in India. He was determined in his life to defend people who weren't being defended. And I think that's why he was courageous on sexual minorities too. So that was a part of Duncan I hugely admired. I wasn't quite as anti-Thatcher as he was, but there we go. But I could see what he was saying. I think, Glen, your developmental psychology, I love that stuff, and have used a bit in the book I've brought here. I'm sorry, I'm shamefully going to advertise my own books, or at least the books in the series I've been editing for the last 25 years, and mainly because it was really Edinburgh, Duncan, but before that Jim Blackie, who really put me on the path of the whole series. I think just to sort of mind a correction in some of the things I've heard today, Duncan certainly was very passionate about learning from other disciplines and listening carefully to other disciplines. But he was riding the shoulders of the giants before him. Jim White at St Andrews and Jim Blackie here in Edinburgh. They produced the revolution in Scotland on practical theology. And it was Jim White I read first, before I'd ever heard of the possibility of a lectureship coming up here in my own subject. And it was a little article he wrote for Theology on futures of practical theology, where he criticizes the hints and tips approach to practical theology. That basically you're there to teach people how to be good ministers. And it showed the obvious flaw in that. It's a bit like teaching it, and people who teach people to be teachers but are not teachers themselves, or at least school teachers themselves. So people who train people for ministry and are working because they've been good ministers in the past, okay, but shouldn't they be learning from somebody actually doing the job now? And that was what's happening in medicine, for example, and in parts of law as well. You'd assume that as normal. Jim Blackie and Jim White, between them in Scotland, produced that huge revolution. And as a result of it, thank goodness, first of all, Alistair was appointed after his PhD in psychology and counselling and so forth. And I was then appointed, quite unexpected to me, because I was one of the few people trying to look seriously at sociology in relation to theology, and had done the postgraduate degrees in both disciplines. Now that was a big breakthrough. It was happening simultaneously in England. Ronald Preston, Elaine's predecessor, had studied at LSE under some of the great economists. He was an expert in that area, but he was a theologian and trying to make sense of that. It took him a long time to develop his ideas, and in retirement, at last he did, and gave us a wonderful treasure trove of books in that. And the same thing was happening in medical ethics, and beginning to happen there at King's London, and the huge steps being made at King's London in terms of listening carefully to doctors, listening carefully to medical ethics, and in fact developing medical ethics, which Alistair became keen and expert on, and I've got dragged into it over the years as well. Now, I think it's that listening which is absolutely crucial. It's been crucial to this series at Cambridge. We've now got 36 books out in the series. The prime requirement is that the person must be properly qualified in the secular discipline themselves, engaged in it, and knowledgeable, deeply knowledgeable about it, before they start trying to bring their theological wisdom to bear on it. Listening very carefully before they start offering any kind of apologetics. So in the 3 books that have come out this year, Sandra Sullivan Dunbar on human dependency in Christian ethics, vital areas, David Elliott on hope and Christian ethics, and my own book, with a wonderful picture of Desmond on the cover, Moral Passion and Christian Ethics, which actually goes very near to many of the things you've been saying, Glen. And I rather hope you might write one for the series on developmental psychology and Christian ethics, because we need one as well. No question of it. Now, that's been germane to that whole series, listening carefully. Duncan was building on that, and his own degree in politics enormously helped him in that. And of course, his huge experience in India was a major contributor to that. But that seems to me the first step in any kind of serious engagement in practical theology, is that you must be listening. You must be listening to what the other audiences do. And Jim Blackie did it with his huge network of contacts. Alistair and David Lyle have known that at first hand. Extraordinary. I worked with him for 4 years, and then he died, sadly. You knew him much longer. But he had this huge contacts around the university, and deeply respected by all sorts of professors of medicine and professors of social administration was on my appointment panel. And you can go around, whether religious or not. I mean, he did that in an extraordinary way. The second plank of what some of you have been hinting at, Glen particularly, but Elaine was also talking about this, is apologetics. I think there is a deeply apologetic side to Duncan. He's passionate about this. He did want to have reforms, and I think he did want to tweak some of the secularists who thought there was no place for theology. I mean, I can think in England of somebody like John Milbank. I mean, his extraordinary work has been in sort of tweaking some of the secularists who think they haven't got, not bringing values, or what John would call theologies, to their work. And he's sort of tweaked out of them that they are. I think Stanley Hauerwas has done a similar task in the States. I'm not wholly a fan of either Milbank or Hauerwas. I think, for me, at least, they exaggerate too much. But the negative side of their work seems to me quite extraordinary and quite extraordinarily important. I ought to add, of course, as Glen mentioned, the work of Michael here on the environment, or Jolyon on media and violence. Two very significant contributions to the series. And both of you have done exactly that. Immersed yourself in the secular, you worked in the secular, and then brought that to bear on theology. And I think that's important. But the apologetics is the challenge. Have we actually got something distinctive to say? Now, I think we do, and I'm not quite as pessimistic as Elaine in this area, and certainly working in medical ethics over the last 20 years, being on the BMA Medical Ethics Committee for 19 years now, and being on the Nuffield Council for the full 6 years, that we're allowed to be on it, taught me that, yes, I think we can add something to the discussion. I agonized about this 10 years ago, having been working for about 10 years in medical ethics and listening carefully to what they were saying. And then I went and had a sabbatical of 6 months, doing nothing but studying the Greek parallel texts of the synoptic healing stories. And what I wanted to know from that was what was distinctive about Jesus' approach to people in need who were sick. And what were the recurring virtues that are either explicit or implicit within these texts? Well, I won't bore you with all the details, but it actually boiled down to, I thought there were 4 things going on there in terms of virtues. And I think these probably were prior in this theological approach. First of all, there was compassion, deep compassion. Jesus responding to people who are deeply in need, shouting out for mercy. And sometimes the word compassion is actually used there. Then there's lots of care, touching and responding to people who are ritually unclean. That seemed to be part of the stories as well. There's a lot of mentions of faith, but quite ambiguous about what sort of faith is actually there, whether it's faith in God, faith in Jesus, faith that they will be healed. Perhaps the word trust gets nearer to it, the virtue that's at the heart of that. And then finishing with what I saw was deep reticence, go and tell nobody, restraint, humility. I sort of put those 4 things together, compassion, care, trust, and humility, and then went back to my committees and thought to myself, what's been missing so far from the kind of discussions I've been hearing? I heard some of the utilitarian philosophers, as I still know, poo-pooing the even mention of compassion. Well, that's just an emotion. We're rational beings. We're not into emotions. I try to show in my book Moral Passion that moral passion is actually essential. It needs to be constrained by reason, but it's actually absolutely essential to any serious moral engagement. I saw quite a bit of care, but not too many careful definitions of care. Trust, I thought, was often missing. And yet, if trust actually breaks down between doctors and their patients, it doesn't really work in many areas of medicine. There does need to be some trust on both parts within a healing relationship. And humility, well, I was almost entirely missing from any of the discourse I could hear. I have gradually, in 1 or 2 of those areas, got some of those virtues back into it, along with the notion of common good. I'm not going to engage in that because you're going to do that tomorrow. But some of you did mention the notion of common good, but we actually managed to get the notion of common good into one of the Nuffield Council reports on biofuels, in which I was on the working party. A bit of a struggle, but eventually people saw what common good was saying, which was different from other notions like public interest or whatever they wanted to have. And that there are some areas of common good that actually say something about ethics, which isn't immediately in our self-interest, but which is in the interests of the common good or people in the future or the world at large. Always quite elusive and difficult. Right, one more point, and sorry, I did say, unlike the rest of you, I hadn't been able to write this down, so I have no idea how long it's going to take. Okay, so I'll make one more point and make that quite quickly. There's one area I think we only just touched on, which I think is absolutely desperately important, and that is providing enough space to address religiously inspired violence. Now, I don't see enough of this happening at the moment, and I do think it requires Christian ethics to actually engage much more seriously and much more sustainedly with the other two Abrahamic faiths in learning how to understand Scripture, how to understand the world, and how to actually produce something which does reduce religiously inspired violence in the world, which I think is probably the biggest troubling factor we have. Those people who regard themselves as morally superior to religious people usually cite religiously inspired violence as the first primary evidence of that. And I think that's something we need to do, and I'm trying to do it myself at the moment for Theos, but I hope other people will too. And I think the beginning in Christian ethics of led by somebody like John Hare in his Divine Command, to actually seriously engage with Islamic theologians as well as Jewish theologians, and alongside Christian theologians. And I think that's a task for us, and I see that as very important for the future. And that's the end.